Grace to you and peace from God our Father and Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, as we have gathered in the midst of his presence here this morning. So what is justice? It's a difficult question, one that generally has political implications, because if someone is talking about justice, then evidently there is a perception that there's some injustice, that there's something wrong with the world that needs adjusting. And one of the difficulties, however, is that how I might look at what's just might be different than how someone else looks at justice. What might even be just to one person is perceived to be injustice to another. And is there, from God's perspective, a unique way of understanding justice? And how is it that we would come alongside of that and really focus on that for our own lives? Well, that really is the question that is before Micah. He's in a very difficult place, and it's a curiosity that God lifts up several prophets at this point in time. There's this terrible civil war, in essence, that has arisen. Israel is divided into north and south. The north is known as Israel, the south is known as Judah. And the north, this is about 700 BC, about 2,700 years ago. The north has gone away. It has been led by all sorts of immoral, disastrous leaders. And it's one of the reasons, really, that God has lifted up prophets, people who speak for God kind of out of the trenches and not out of a leadership perspective, because the leaders were doing so poorly. But especially so in the north, succession was almost always by assassination. It was just horrible, and some of the worst stories of the Bible are found during that period, particularly, again, in this northern area of Israel. Well, they get susceptible. And if you follow my good map here, here's the Mediterranean Sea, here's Israel, and Assyria is up here. Why Israel is important is because it is called the Fertile Crescent. Over here, this is all desert. You really don't want to travel through there. So if you want to get to like Egypt, you got to go through Israel to get there. And so that's why through the eons, this land has been very important. Well, Assyria comes in, and they lay waste to the northern region. And because they're smart from a political perspective, they take virtually all the people back into Assyria and have them intermarry, so that nationalism, that, if you will, kind of even patriotic identity with being the Hebrew people, then is immersed in a new culture and lessened. So that's what we have going on here. That happened about 22 years before Micah is writing probably what we see today. And so there's that. You'll recognize that even in this particular text, he speaks about Assyria, the concern that Assyria would come and do the same thing in the south to Judah that it did to the north. Well, that won't happen. But at 587 BC, so a little over 100 years later, Babylon will become the power of the region, and they will indeed come in and subdue Judah, taking those folks into exile, and the all-important temple will be destroyed. So what you really have going on here is the people that are speaking for God are giving these folks who live in a terrible time of injustice a moment of hope. Some confidence that God is going to do what God said he would do. God will show up. God will fix things. And until that happens, until that comes to fruition, you have one job, people, and that is to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God. That's your job. Okay. And so those are Micah's words. But again, there are other significant prophets that are around in this time that are contemporaries. One is Amos, again, not a particularly well-known prophet, but he has also the same type of words. He says, "Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." And then there is the prophet that we're probably more familiar with, Isaiah. Handel's Messiah has a lot of that language, really powerful ways of speaking about who God is. Prince of Peace, no less. Lord of Lords, King of Kings. That sense, if you back off and say, well, what really do those latter two terms mean? It means that any kind of earthly power, even a spiritual kind of power, whatever it is, however you label a king, however you label a lord, in how is helpful in English, we have little letters, and then when we do capitals, that means it's more important. So that's how we do it, that Jesus will be the Lord of Lords. He will be Lord with a capital L over every other kind of conceivable power. And so for these people, they're seeing their promised land go away. Try to enter into what this was for them. Because now for us, 4,000 years ago, 2000 BC, Abraham gets this covenant. They're going to be this chosen people. It takes them really 1,000 years until that happens, when David is king and Israel is truly a power in the region. But that quickly goes away. And by 587 BC, it is totally gone. And when we are Christians, we sort of leave Jewish history behind with the time of Jesus. But to understand, one of the reasons that people really had a problem with Jesus was because the Romans were controlling the area. Yes, Cyrus, the king of Persia, is going to finally allow and encourage the Hebrew people to go back home. So they get to go back home, I don't know, around 300 BC, something like that. And they rebuild the temple, and they're trying to rebuild their lives. But the Romans are in control. And so they really don't have any sense of autonomy or independence. And so really, from this period, from 587 BC until the mid-20th century AD, there is no sense of an independent, with any sort of sense, power to the nation of Israel. So what a huge period of time. Folks who understand themselves to be the people of God experiencing one injustice after another. So how do you keep your faith? How do you keep your confidence in God through all of these kinds of troubles? Well, it is Veterans Day. And what an awesome opportunity that the 1 out of 7 chance of worshiping with Sunday being November 11th happened this year, and all the better that it happens to be the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. How appropriate, and I celebrate that we recognize the end of a war, that is the purpose. It is always for the sense of discovering peace. It feels to me that World War I in our memories gets a bit lost in the context of World War II. But yet, 14 million people are going to die in 4 years in World War I. This is a big deal. And on this day, 100 years later, we celebrate that hope for peace, knowing full well, as we look back from our perspective now, that will be a very short-lived peace. So, how is it that we are the people of God to live in justice, not the least of which, as we are on Veterans Day here, in the kind of understanding that if you're looking for peace, then again, evidently there's some sort of conflict. Now, not the least of which for Protestant Christians in general and Lutheran Christians in particular, there are really 3 people that form the foundation for how we understand God and God's people working. One is Paul in his writings, these letters in the New Testament that really delves into grace. And of course, another will be in the Middle Ages, Martin Luther. But in between is St. Augustine, someone that we don't talk all that much about, but he's a profound story. His life was a total mess, and through the power of prayer from his mama, his life one day gets transformed. And he becomes this gung-ho Christian and one of the most important theologians who has ever lived. And he too then will be very much focused on the understanding of grace and how that fits within the larger expanse of life. So interestingly, Augustine will develop what he called the just war theory in 400 AD, so 1600 years ago. And no one since has come close to developing anything that would supplant it. it really is still, amazingly, the primary document that someone would look to if you want to say, from a religious perspective, what is a just war? And I'm going to just briefly note the points that he makes. The first is that it's a last resort to go to war. That should be fairly self-evident, but that you've done everything else that you possibly could think of to avert war, but now you don't have any other option. The second is legitimate authority. You and your buddies just can't say, well, I think I'll go to war with Canada. You just can't do that. It needs to have a sense that you're all in this together. Whatever the nation, however you comprise your government, whatever that might be, you need to be united in this effort. And you need to have a just cause. Usually that means from a defense perspective, that you are seeking the security of your own nation. Certainly that you are not being an aggressor, that you are not seeking power. A probability of success is an interesting one from Augustine's perspective, that even though you might have every cause, there's a terrible injustice. His perspective, anyway, is if people are just going to die and nothing's going to change for the better, don't do it. The next one is a right intention, meaning a likely better peace will happen. Do you feel confident that by going to war, by going into this military venture, that there's a good likelihood that you will have more peace in the future, having come out the other side of that, than you do now? Then there's proportionality, meaning that if you just have if some other nation comes and, I don't know, they kill one or two of your people for a reason or something, you don't go into their nation and kill thousands or millions. That there's some proportionality to that. The last one is the one that made Augustine's just war theory very popular when I was a lad, because it is about civilian casualties. That except for if you really, really can't help it, someone kind of got in the way. But the bottom line is essentially no civilian casualties. Well, in the days when nuclear weapons were developing, to not have civilian casualties was almost impossible. And in fact, to some degree, it's the other. And certainly in our own day, when we talk about terrorism, that means that we have taken these kinds of conflicts literally to the civilians, and obviously doesn't fit within anywhere close the definition of a just war theory. But those are kinds of the things that at least for Augustine, and dramatically enough, they still speak into our own lives with a helpful way of addressing when is it appropriate, when is it not. I often talk about that there are two people that I consider little H heroes. I often will put it in the context that really Jesus is the only hero, but there are two people that have lived on this planet that I appreciate specifically how they lived their lives in a difficult moment with integrity about their faith. And they really wrestled with those issues in a real manner. One of those is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and I do talk about it from time to time. It's neither here nor there, but he did happen to be a Lutheran. It was during World War II, a very prolific writer. Some people, including me, would say, interestingly enough, his words speak more profoundly, more obviously to us in our day than they did to his contemporary readers. Books like Cost of Discipleship. What does it really mean to follow Jesus, to take up one's cross and that kind of a thing? The difficulty and those challenges. Well, World War II, not the least of which for him being a German, there were all sorts of challenges. And not the least of which, what it was to be church in Germany during that time, a lot of questions. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a man of the world. He would go and lecture and things like that, and he actually was living in the United States. So he could have just sat here and lived out his life happily. And he was a pacifist next door to it, almost. That was his understanding that the whole business of Jesus talking about turning the other cheek and that kind of stuff, that you're you really have to avoid injury of another person at almost all cost. But then he kept looking at Germany and the things that were happening, the amount of destruction of people's lives, and he couldn't handle it anymore. So he came to this conclusion that even though he was everything but a pacifist, that to ignore all of the terrible killing that was happening of innocents, that was something worse, to just kind of sit by and allow that to continue unchallenged. So he goes to Germany. He's a part of a plot to execute Hitler. Obviously, that doesn't work, and he himself is executed as a result. But I so appreciate how he struggled and the reality of that. Kind of, regardless of how exactly he ended up, is not the point. The point was that he wrestled with these things. That, what do you do with the injustices of the world? But yet God calls you to love. What does that look like? What does it really mean ultimately to love someone? Those were the things that Bonhoeffer had to address. And it's something that we all have to address when we encounter whatever the issues of life may be. Well, ultimately, of course, we're about Jesus, the one that in this context we might reference as the Prince of Peace. What does he have to say to us, kind of bottom line, when it comes to justice? And in this context of Veterans Day, you particularly think of Jesus when he says there's no greater love than to give one's life for someone else. And that might mean literally, but certainly for Jesus, it means figuratively as well. That there is this sacrificial, servant orientation to love. That what drives us is concern for the other over concern for self. On Veterans Day, we certainly honor that and recognize the people that, in a context of worship, for God and country, were willing to risk their lives, were willing to do something out of concern for others beyond themselves. And that really fits precisely with what Jesus talks about in saying there's no greater love than to give one's life for someone else. So, we want to recognize, we want to honor those who are veterans or active military in our midst. So if that's you, if you've been a veteran, would you please rise and we will honor you. Thank you. It really is kind of disconcerting when you do what I do, and how the injustices of the world, I guess thanks to global and immediate media, it's just the injustices are too obvious every week. So we were reminded this past week of how difficult it can be, particularly for those who've served in the military in a combat type situation, to come back. And we all know what the letters PTSD stand for. It's that profound amongst us. And that once, in a terribly rare manner, people might act out of that in a violent way. But far too often, people will take all of that that's welled up inside of them, and the harm goes against themselves. So it seems to me, if we're going to talk about Jesus and justice on a Veterans Day, that's certainly one of those pieces is concern for those folks who have offered of their lives in this kind of service and have experienced horrors, things that stick with them, and to have that kind of a sense amongst us that we are going to stand alongside and we're going to find every way possible to bring justice, if you will, to their lives. We will again see with Jesus the ultimate reality of what it is to offer one's life for another. And that's really cool in and of itself, But when you do it in the context of Jesus, in the context of a Christian expression, it takes on a whole new meaning and a whole new power. Because for some reason, evil doesn't seem to recognize or be able to see beyond the immediate reality. Because Jesus dies on a cross, and evil seems to celebrate. Thinking this is the end of the story, we have won, Jesus went down. The resurrection somehow is a surprise. They didn't see it coming. And that is one of the pieces that from a Christian perspective, we need to grab a hold of and champion, is because for every time of sacrificial love, giving of oneself for the benefit of a neighbor, there's a resurrection. There's always a resurrection. And God is always making things right. So what are your injustices? You know, the opportunity to give of one's life for someone else is every moment of our lives, every day. Whatever you're doing for the rest of today, whatever you're doing tomorrow morning, whoever it is that you're encountering at home, work, school, grocery store, restaurant, whatever it is, there are opportunities where injustice will be present before you, and you will have the opportunity to let it be, or somehow state that being a Christian and your values are going to lead you in a certain direction. Yeah, I was making an obvious allusion earlier to we've had yet one more iteration of a mass murder. We honor, not the least of which this day, one law enforcement individual who was willing to risk his life for the sake of others. Thankfully, the vast majority of time for our lives, when we are following Jesus in saying that we will take up our cross, that we will seek to give of our lives for the sake of another, that doesn't mean we're literally risking our earthly lives. So there are these opportunities before you. Whatever you discover are the injustices, there are two things to keep in mind. One is that God promises that He's making it right. Now, it may not be in our lifetime, because we have all these biblical stories that bears that out. But be confident. We have hope. You know, people say, well, I hope I win the lottery. Well, that's like a 1 in 100 million chance. When you say you hope in God, that's a given. It will happen. You have hope. You have confidence in God. It's a different perspective, different definition of what hope is. So the first is, whenever you discover injustice, God is doing what God's supposed to be doing to make it right, and it will become right. For your part, then, God calls you to do this: to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly. Let's pray.